It ambushed you. No warning, no build-up, just one moment you were fine, and the next you weren't. Something shifted in your chest before your brain even registered what happened. A comment, a silence, a tone that shouldn't have meant anything. And suddenly you were somewhere else entirely. Not in the room, not in the conversation, not in the version of yourself you've been working so hard to become. You were somewhere older, somewhere smaller, reacting to something that, on paper, didn't warrant it. Because you've done the work. You've read the books, listened to the podcasts, maybe even sat in a therapist's office. You understand intellectually that other people's behavior isn't about you. You know you're supposed to breathe, to pause, to respond instead of react. You know all of this. And yet, here you are. That's not a failure of willpower. It's not a character flaw. It's not proof that you're broken or that growth isn't real. What it is a signal, a very specific, very honest signal coming from a part of you that hasn't been reached yet. This video is about that part, not the version of you that reads and reflects and wants to evolve, but the version that still flinches, still fires back, still freezes. Because until you understand that version of yourself, you'll keep meeting it in the worst possible moments. If you've ever thought, why do I keep doing this? Comment, still healing below. You're not alone in it, and this video is for you. Why you keep getting triggered. Let's rewind. Not to the moment that triggered you, but to something much earlier. Something you probably don't think about when you're in the middle of a reaction, because in that moment, the past is the last place your mind goes. Here's what's actually happening when you get triggered. Your nervous system isn't responding to the present. It's responding to a memory of danger, one that lives so deep in your body that it bypasses your rational mind entirely. By the time your prefrontal cortex, the thinking, reasoning part of your brain, has a chance to weigh in, the reaction has already started. You're already tense, already defensive, already 3 sentences into an argument you didn't consciously choose to have. Neuroscientists call this the amygdala hijack. Your brain's threat detection system, ancient, fast, and completely indiscriminate, fires before thought can intervene. It was designed to keep you alive in a world of physical predators. But you're not being chased by anything. You're standing in a kitchen, or sitting at a desk, or reading a text message, and yet your body is reacting as though your survival depends on what happens next. Why? Because at some point in your past, it did. Or at least, it felt like it did. This is where most conversations about triggers stop, at the neuroscience. Your amygdala fired. Here's how to calm it down, and that's useful as far as it goes. But it doesn't answer the deeper question, which is, why does this particular thing trigger you specifically? Why does someone else brush off the exact comment that sends you into a spiral? Why can you handle some conflict with total calm and then completely lose yourself over something that seems, from the outside, far smaller? The answer isn't in your brain chemistry. It's in your story. Every trigger has a history. Every reaction that feels disproportionate, every time you've thought, why am I so upset about this, is pointing you towards something unresolved. Not something wrong with you, something that happened to you or around you, or was repeatedly done to you at a time when you didn't have the resources to fully process it. Think about the kinds of things that set people off: being ignored, being criticized in front of others, someone raising their voice unexpectedly, a partner going quiet during an argument, being told you're too sensitive, being left on red. someone taking credit for your work, someone laughing at the wrong moment. None of these things are inherently catastrophic. But for the person who grew up in a home where being ignored meant danger, where criticism always came with shame, where raised voices preceded violence, where emotional withdrawal was used as punishment, these moments don't just feel uncomfortable, they feel like emergencies, because their nervous system learned at a foundational level that these signals meant something, that they required an immediate response. And here's the part that catches most people off guard. That learning doesn't disappear just because you grew up. It doesn't vanish because you moved out, or cut contact, or found a healthier relationship, or started going to therapy. The nervous system doesn't update on a timeline that matches your intellectual understanding. You can know that your boss isn't your father, that your partner isn't your mother, that this argument isn't that argument, and still feel in your body like it is. That gap between what you know and what you feel is where the trigger lives. And closing it isn't about knowing more. It's about going back to understand what the feeling is actually carrying. The unhealed wound behind every reaction. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's one of those lines that sounds philosophical until you actually sit with what it means. And then it becomes uncomfortable because you realize he's describing something most of us do every single day. The unhealed wound isn't always dramatic. People sometimes dismiss this conversation because they think it only applies to those who've experienced obvious, identifiable trauma, abuse, neglect, loss, violence, and yes, those experiences absolutely leave marks. But wounds don't require catastrophe to form. They form wherever there was a consistent unmet need. Wherever a child learned that expressing certain emotions led to punishment or withdrawal. Wherever love felt conditional on performance. Wherever I'm scared was met with, you're fine, stop it. Wherever confusion was punished instead of answered. These aren't always dramatic moments. Sometimes they're just patterns, repeated dynamics that slowly taught you something about how the world works, how people respond to you, how safe it is to be yourself. And those teachings, absorbed before you had the language or the cognitive development to question them, became the operating system running beneath everything you think and feel and do. Psychologists call these core beliefs. Things like, I'm not enough. People leave. If I'm vulnerable, I'll get hurt. I have to earn love. Anger means danger. Conflict means the relationship is ending. You didn't choose these beliefs. You formed them because they were the most logical conclusions a young mind could draw from the evidence available at the time. They were adaptive. They were survival strategies. They were, in their moment, intelligent responses to a world that felt unpredictable or threatening. But you're not in that world anymore, and the beliefs don't know that. So when something happens in your present life that rhymes, even faintly, with the original wound, the system activates. Not because you're weak, not because you haven't grown, but because the wound is still there, still carrying the same emotional charge it always had, waiting for someone to finally pay attention to it in the right way. This is what Bessel van der Kolk means when he says the body keeps the score. Your intellectual understanding of your past doesn't automatically heal the somatic imprint of it. You can narrate your childhood with complete clarity. You can understand your parents' limitations with compassion. You can trace every dysfunctional pattern back to its source. And your nervous system can still respond to a triggering stimulus the same way it did when you were 9 years old. Because healing isn't just cognitive. It's not just about understanding the story. It's about metabolizing the emotion that was never fully felt, the need that was never fully met, the grief that was never fully allowed. Here's how this plays out in real life. You're in a relationship, and your partner gets quiet after a disagreement. Nothing dramatic, they just go a little distant while they process. But something in you can't tolerate it. You need to resolve it now. You push, you ask questions, you over-explain yourself. You might even pick the fight back up just to get a reaction, because silence to you doesn't feel like processing. It feels like abandonment. It feels like the prelude to something being over. Your partner isn't abandoning you, but a part of you, the part that learned what emotional withdrawal really meant in a specific house with specific people a long time ago, doesn't know the difference. That part is running the show, and until it's acknowledged, it will keep running it, no matter how many times you intellectually remind yourself that this relationship is different. The wound isn't the enemy. It's a message. It's the part of you that never got what it needed asking one more time, whether it's finally safe to receive it. Your triggers aren't sabotaging your growth. They're directing you toward the exact place your growth needs to go. The question is whether you're willing to look there, or whether you'll keep trying to manage the signal without ever reading the message. The illusion of doing the work. This is the part that might sting a little, and it's worth sitting with rather than skipping past. There's a version of doing the work that is genuinely transformative, and there's another version that is, if you're honest about it, a sophisticated form of avoidance. They can look almost identical from the outside, and sometimes from the inside too. The difference is subtle, but it's everything. Real work changes something at the level of the wound. It moves the emotional charge. It updates the nervous system. It doesn't just give you a framework for understanding your dysfunction. It actually reduces it. You find that things which used to send you into a spiral now land differently. Not because you suppressed them, not because you performed composure, but because something genuinely shifted. The other version, the avoidance dressed as growth, is much more common and much more seductive because it feels productive. You're reading, you're reflecting, you're using the right vocabulary. You can explain your attachment style, your defense mechanisms, your childhood wounds. You've got the language of healing down perfectly. But if you look honestly at your actual behavior, in the moments that count, in the relationships that matter, the patterns are largely the same. You're still triggered by the same things. You're just better at analyzing it afterward. This is sometimes called spiritual bypassing, using the tools and language of inner work to stay one step above the actual feeling rather than moving through it. It's the person who meditates daily but still can't tolerate being criticized. The one who journals religiously but still shuts down the moment a conversation gets emotionally demanding. The one who knows they have abandonment issues but still anxiously texts 3 times before getting a response. Knowledge without integration is just a more articulate version of being stuck. And this matters because there's a specific kind of frustration that comes from this place, a frustration that you probably recognize. It sounds like, I've done so much work, why am I still like this? That question contains an assumption worth examining. It assumes that the work you've done should have reached the place where the trigger lives. But has it? Has the work actually touched the wound? Or has it circled around it, named it, categorized it, and left it in place? Real healing requires you to be in the feeling, not just think about it. It requires you to let the grief move through you instead of intellectualizing why you're grieving. It requires you to sit with the need, the actual embodied, sometimes childlike need, rather than rushing to reframe it or resolve it. This is uncomfortable in a way that reading about it simply isn't. That's the distinction. There's also something worth naming about the social performance of doing the work, the way self-awareness has become, in certain spaces, a kind of identity, and identity is something we protect. So there's a subtle pressure sometimes to present as someone who has it figured out, who has processed their trauma, who doesn't get triggered by small things anymore. And that pressure, the pressure to be healed rather than be healing, can quietly redirect you away from the rawness that real growth requires. None of this is meant as an indictment. It's a reorientation, because the goal of this video isn't to make you feel like you've been doing it wrong. It's to point you toward what doing it right might actually feel like. And it feels less like mastery and more like honesty, less like having the answers and more like being willing to sit with the questions a little longer than is comfortable. The work that changes you isn't always the work that looks impressive. It's the quiet, unglamorous private work of actually feeling what you've only been thinking about. The stimulus-response gap. Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps. He lost his wife, his parents, his brother. He was stripped of every external freedom a human being can have. And in the middle of all of that, in a place where almost nothing was left, he found something that couldn't be taken from him. He called it the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose his response to any given situation, not to control the situation, not to feel nothing, but to insert a moment of conscious choice between what happened to him and how he responded. That space between stimulus and response is where everything changes. It sounds simple. In practice, it's one of the hardest things a human being can develop, because the whole nature of a trigger is that it collapses that space. The stimulus hits and the response fires, and there's no gap, just a seamless, lightning-fast chain of cause and effect that feels completely involuntary. That's the design. That's how the nervous system protects you from threats, speed over accuracy every time. So the work isn't about eliminating the trigger. It isn't about becoming someone who never gets activated. That's not freedom. That's numbness, and it comes at a significant cost. The work is about gradually, consistently widening the gap between what hits you and what you do with it. Creating enough space that choice becomes possible. Not easy, not automatic, just possible. Here's what that gap actually looks like in practice, because it's not as abstract as it sounds. It starts with noticing, not analyzing, not reframing, just noticing, feeling the tightening in your chest before you say anything, recognizing the heat rising in your face, catching the familiar thought pattern that's starting to run. These physical sensations are the first warning that your nervous system has been activated, and they arrive before the reaction fully takes hold if you're paying attention. Most people miss this window entirely because they're not trained to look for it. They're trained to respond to what's happening outside them, not what's happening inside. So the first practice, and it genuinely is a practice, something you build slowly over time, is simply learning to notice your own internal state in real time, not in retrospect, when you're replaying the argument in your head at midnight. In the moment before you speak, the moment before you send the text. That noticing creates a micro-pause. And a micro-pause is enough to introduce a question. Is what I'm about to do coming from my present self or from something older? You don't have to answer it perfectly. You don't have to trace the wound all the way back to its origin in real time. You just have to ask it, because asking it is what interrupts the automaticity. This is where the Stoics were onto something essential. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about events. The event itself is neutral. What we make it mean, and how we respond to that meaning, is where our agency lives. That's not a cold or detached philosophy. It's a deeply practical one. It's saying the external world will always do what it does. People will say what they say. Things will happen that you didn't choose. Your sovereignty lives not in changing that, but in what you do with the space between it happening and you responding. Over time, and this is the part that feels almost miraculous when it starts to happen, the gap gets wider on its own. Not because you force it, but because as you do the deeper work of understanding your wounds, the original charge behind the trigger starts to diminish. The thing that used to feel like an emergency starts to feel like a familiar sensation you know how to be with. Not pleasant necessarily, but no longer in control of you. You stop reacting from the wound, and you start responding from the person you've been building, slowly, honestly, imperfectly, ever since you decided to look at yourself clearly. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. How to actually stop reacting on autopilot. Everything discussed so far is foundational, but understanding something and living it are two very different things. So let's get specific about what this actually looks like as a daily practice, not as an ideal. The first shift is the most counterintuitive. Stop trying to stop reacting. When your primary goal in any triggering moment is to not react, you're fighting your own nervous system. And your nervous system will win almost every time because it's faster and older and more powerful than your willpower. The goal isn't suppression, it's redirection. You're not trying to prevent the internal response. You're learning to give it somewhere useful to go before it comes out in ways you'll regret. This starts with your body. Before your mouth opens, before your fingers type, check in with your body. Where do you feel this? Your jaw? Your stomach? Your throat? The tension in your shoulders? Sensations are data. They're telling you how activated you are, and that tells you how much space you need before you engage. A mild tension in the chest might mean you can still participate in the conversation relatively clearly. A full body flood of adrenaline means you need to step back, and any response you give right now is going to be coming from somewhere reactive, not reflective. This is where the simple, almost embarrassingly basic tools come in. And they work not because they're magic, but because they directly intervene in the physiological state. A slow exhale, longer than the inhale, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It literally begins to bring the body out of threat response and back toward regulation. Cold water on the face does something similar. Moving your body, even just walking to another room, can interrupt the loop. These aren't coping mechanisms in the dismissive sense of the phrase. They're physiological interventions that create the conditions for choice. Once you're slightly more regulated, not perfectly calm, just less flooded, the next step is to get curious instead of reactive. Ask yourself, what is the story I'm telling myself right now? Not what happened, but what am I making this mean? Because the trigger isn't just the external event. It's the interpretation your system instantly layered over it. Someone was quiet, and your system said, "They're pulling away." Someone gave feedback, and your system said, "They think you're not good enough." That interpretation happened faster than thought, but you can catch it after the fact and examine it. Is that story true? Is it definitely true? Or is it the most familiar story, the one your wound has been telling for years? This questioning isn't about invalidating your feelings. Your feelings are real and they matter. But your feelings are responding to your interpretation of events, not necessarily to the events themselves. And interpretations can be updated when you're calm enough to look at them honestly. The third piece is repair and reflection. Not in the heat of the moment, but afterward. When you do react in a way you're not proud of, the instinct is often to either defend it, "I was justified," or spiral into shame. "I'm a mess, I'll never change." Both responses miss the opportunity. What's actually useful is to sit with what happened and ask, what was the trigger? What did it remind me of? What need was activated? And what would I do differently with 5 more seconds of space? That reflection, done consistently and without judgment, is where the real reprogramming happens. You're essentially teaching yourself a new pattern, one that your nervous system will eventually begin to adopt, not because you forced it, but because you kept showing up with curiosity instead of condemnation. This is slow work. It doesn't feel impressive from the inside. But every time you catch yourself a moment sooner, every time you choose inquiry over reaction, you are genuinely rewiring something. That's not metaphor. That's neuroplasticity in action. The new story you get to live. Come back to where we started. That moment, someone said something, a tone, a look, a single word, and everything in you fired at once. That moment hasn't changed. It happened. It was real. And if you're honest, some version of it will probably happen again. Because you're a human being with a history, living in a world full of other human beings with their own histories, and sometimes those histories collide in ways that activate something deep. But here's what can change, and what does change, for the people who do this work with real honesty. What that moment means to you, what you do with it, how long you stay inside it, how much of yourself you lose before you find your way back. There's a version of you, not a perfect version, not an invulnerable one, but a more integrated version who encounters a trigger and recognizes it, not intellectually in the detached sense of, "Oh, I see what's happening here," but genuinely, from somewhere settled inside you. A version who can feel the activation and stay present with it long enough to ask, what is this actually about? What does this part of me need right now? And then, and this is the part that used to seem impossible, actually give it to yourself. Not ask someone else to provide it, not react in ways designed to get it from the outside, but turn toward the wound directly and offer it what it's been reaching for all along: acknowledgement, presence, the message that you're not in danger, that this moment is different, that you are different. This is what reparenting yourself actually means, not a self-help buzzword, a genuine practice of becoming the stable, responsive adult presence for your own younger, frightened parts that wasn't always available to them then. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require that you never get triggered again. It requires consistency, showing up to your own interior life with the same patience you'd extend to someone you love. The title of this video, Never React, Never Explain, Just Ignore, might have led you to expect something different. A formula for stoic indifference, a way to seem unbothered. But real unbotheredness isn't a performance. It's not about having a face that betrays nothing while a storm rages inside. That's not peace. That's suppression with better posture. True equanimity, the kind that Frankl found in the most impossible circumstances imaginable, the kind the Stoics pointed toward, the kind that actual inner peace is made of, comes from having done the interior work so thoroughly that the old wounds no longer run the show. Not because they've been silenced, because they've been heard. Because the need behind each trigger has been met, or at least acknowledged enough times that it doesn't have to scream to get your attention. When that starts to happen, something quietly remarkable becomes possible. You can be in a difficult conversation without disappearing into it. You can hear criticism without collapsing under it or defending against it with everything you have. You can be misunderstood without needing to immediately correct it. You can tolerate someone being wrong about you, being angry at you, withdrawing from you, and feel the discomfort of that without being controlled by it. That's not cold. That's not distance. That's not indifference. It's the deepest form of presence, because you're fully there, feeling everything and choosing what you do with it. That's what the gap gives you. Not the absence of feeling, the freedom to feel without being ruled by it. So the next time someone says something, a tone, a look, a word that lands wrong, and you feel the familiar tightening beginning, pause, just for a breath. Ask what the feeling is carrying. Listen to it, the way you'd listen to someone you care about. You are not your reactions. You are the awareness behind them. And that awareness, patient, curious, unhurried, is more than enough to build something real on. Real growth doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly in the moments you catch yourself before the reaction takes hold. If that's what you're working toward, leave "I'm becoming" in the comments and mean it. Subscribe to the Stoic mode, turn on notifications, and stay close. What's coming next goes even deeper. You've already done the hardest part by staying until the end. Thank you for being here. Keep going.